So welcome everyone to something quite special. We already have our student council for several years now. It started in 2022, but it's quite exceptional that we're not doing these interviews on Zoom, but this time in person. And one of the first programs also to be organized here in this space, the A-Frame Theater, that will be the performance space of the Wende Museum. So very happy that this is possible now, and on these special occasions as well. As I mentioned, by the way, I should of course first introduce myself. My name is Joos Siegel. I'm the Chief Curator and Director of Programming at the Wende Museum. And the Student Council is a partnership between the Wende Museum, the Thomas Mann House, and Dublab Radio. So the interviews we do are broadcast by Dublab and then part of their digital archive. And they're also recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, the Wende Museum YouTube channel, in 1 or 2 weeks from now. The first year, the topic of the Student Council was In Search of Truth. The second year, it was the political mandate of the arts, and this year it's democracy and vulnerability. Those topics are always in conversation with the Thomas Mann House, but as you can hear, very topical subjects that also reflect on the changing political climate at home and internationally, and that is something that it will be very specifically addressed to as well today. I won't go into details because you will hear all about it. I wanted to invite my colleague Oliver Hartman, director of the Thomas Mann House, to also welcome you and say a few words. Yeah.
Thank you, Joos. Also from my side, a very warm welcome here at the A-Frame Theater. It's great to be on stage with 5 very smart students and 2 wonderful guests that we could invite today for our conversation on democracy and its vulnerabilities. As Joos mentioned, I'm the director of the Thomas Mann House, and we are a residency center and space for transatlantic debates located in the former exile home of Nobel Prize winner and writer Thomas Mann in Pacific Palisades. And we organize a lot of events, workshops. We collaborate with partners such as the Wende Museum, and I must say this is one of our favorite partners and collaborations and programs that we're doing over the years. I just want to say one small detail about the Student Council. For the past 3 years, we have done it as mostly online conversation. Today is our 3rd special edition in person, where also our members of the Student Council, they're flying in from New York, from Washington, sometimes from Chicago, or from Pennsylvania, and it's always for them a great chance as well to actually meet in person and not online. And for the next year, we will switch a little bit the format, and we are thinking about turning these very meaningful conversations into podcasts, professionally produced also with the Dublab radio. And for those of you who are still students, and I hope there are still some students in this group, we have currently an open call running. So if you're interested in maybe conducting interviews as well and getting to know a lot of interesting people, check out the Wende Museum's website or the Thomas Mann website and submit your application. I think the deadline is end of November somehow, middle of November. Okay, so you still have some time. Great. Last but not least, I would like to thank a lot the Wende Museum for carrying out this event today, also for Gina and Clara from the teams of the Wende and the Thomas Mann House. And Matthew, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Matthew Jones, and alongside the other members of the Student Council, I'd like to welcome you to this very special in-person interview. We are privileged to be joined by 2 world-class scholars of fascism and political culture today. We have Dr. Marla Stone and Dr. Jonathan Homola. Dr. Stone is currently a professor of history at Occidental College, having recently completed tenure as the Andrew W. Mellon Humanities Professor at the American Academy in Rome. She is a specialist of the history of fascism and in questions of dictatorship and genocide in the modern era. Her research emphasizes the relationship among culture, politics, and the state in the 20th century, and she's published a substantive body of work on topics such as Italian fascist cultural politics, anti-communism, the contemporary far right in Europe, Italian Holocaust memory, and of particular interest to our talk today, the continuities and discontinuities between historic fascism and its contemporary manifestations. Dr. Homola is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at UCLA. He is a comparativist and a political methodologist, and his research projects generate really useful empirical data that provides valuable support for further scholarship. His work deals with questions of representation and electoral preferences in Western democracies in Eastern Europe, with two primary emphases. The first being the causes and attitudes of xenophobia and the support for right-wing extremism, and the second being gender and politics. Both scholars bring a profound understanding of fascism and its complex political, cultural, and psychological dimensions. And I know that the conversation between them will be illuminating, challenging, thought-provoking, and empowering. I've had a blast engaging with their work these past few weeks, and I think we're all in for a treat. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to our guest today. And now I'm going to hand it off to our moderator.
Hello, everyone. Thank you again so much for joining us. A little bit about the logistics of this interview. It'll be an hour with the Student Council and our two speakers, and then we will open up the floor to Q&A. So while you're listening, if you have any questions, jot them down. It's a really amazing opportunity that we have today. So to get us started and maybe to give both of our guests an opportunity to introduce themselves a little bit more, I'm going to hand it over to Sarah and have Sarah get us started.
Thank you so much, Emma. Yeah, really just as a way to get to know you guys and know where you're coming from. I was wondering, how did you first become interested in your historical specializations? What stood out to you about them, or why do you believe they're important?
It's really, really exciting to be here, and yeah, thanks for organizing all of this. In terms of how I got interested in what I'm studying, so mostly for today, sort of causes and consequences of xenophobia, I would sort of give an answer in two parts. One is sort of the academic part, where I would say during my undergraduate studies, I worked on a project where we looked at how parties are doing in elections based on sort of the policies that they're standing for. And what we found in Western Europe is something that's pretty well established. It's that parties are doing well with sort of relatively moderate positions, basically when they are close to what we call the median voter position. We also studied Eastern Europe in that project, and there we found sort of the opposite finding, that parties were really benefiting from taking more extreme positions. And so that's something that I think I found really, really interesting at the time, and then sort of started basically working more and more on that topic as things developed. On a more personal side, I would say that I'm from Germany. I grew up in Berlin. And so I would say, at least in my generation, when you sort of went through the German educational system, there was really no way that you could possibly avoid sort of Germany's history, rightfully so. It's sort of a huge topic, a huge theme of emphasis, of course, in the educational system. And so I think going through that and sort of seeing the world around me, where even at the time there were always like a few sort of far-right parties that were running in elections, not quite as successful as sort of the main party is doing today, but still there was always a discussion about it. And I think I always found it really fascinating and couldn't really wrap my head around how people could sort of get the same education as I did, read the same books that I did, perhaps go on school trips to a concentration camp, and then sort of come away from all that and sort of still support parties like that and have attitudes like that, was something that I always, sort of really couldn't make sense of, and I think found really fascinating on a personal level as well. And then I would say that sort of since that time period when I went to school or my undergraduate studies, really I think the topic has just become more and more important, really, sort of in Western Europe, around the world to some extent, unfortunately, and so yes, it's still a major theme of my research now today.
Great. I also want to thank the Vendée Museum and the Thomas Mann House for organizing today's event, and of course the Student Council. There was a core question very early on, even as an undergraduate, that drew me to the study of fascism, which was when I realized that fascism always emerged out of democracies. And I became fascinated with the idea that what leads people to abandon, if we think about the history of Europe, the struggle for democratic rights, the struggle for civil liberties and the right to vote in the 19th and early 20th century, and then in the wake of World War I, the legal and voluntary abandonment of that by a plurality of the population, right? If we're thinking of Italy and Germany. Not a majority, but a big enough plurality. And so the question of what made people ready to embrace dictatorship, what was going on in their society, in their culture, in their politics, that had reached that point that dictatorship seemed more appealing. And then once I became very interested in that question, I was drawn to the study of Italian fascism because in the mid-1980s, when I began my dissertation, in the United States, a lot of people were studying Nazi Germany, but very few people were looking at Italian fascism, and Italian fascism was the first fascism, right? It is Mussolini, between 1919 and 1922, when they're a movement that comes up with this ideology, and then from 1922 to 43, we have this long stretch of fascist government. So it's in Mussolini's Italy that we can see what fascist rule is really like. Because in the Nazi case, if we think of the time that the regime is in power without going to war, it's very short. It's 1933 to 36, where in Italy we have this long stretch in which they are drawing in the consent and collaboration of the population. So I was also very interested in that how a dictatorship can bind a population to it with both the carrot and the stick, right? So what also was emerging as I was studying Italian fascism was an abandonment of the idea that these regimes only held power through terror and secret police and camps. No, they held power actually by drawing people in, meeting social and political needs. And we'll get more into this, but that is the big distinction between what I would consider American fascism and European fascism, in that European fascism believes in a state sector, believes in meeting the needs of the population, albeit from a top-down authoritarian manner. And then finally, I'll say what is currently really what I'm working on, and it is fascinating me, is the role of enemies, both in authoritarian regimes and in democracies. How saying, oh, we have an existential enemy, we better move forward, move towards authoritarianism to protect ourselves from that enemy.
Yeah, two things that you just brought up, Marla, kind of alarm bells went off in my head, that fascism comes out of democracy and the word enemies, which I think in the past couple of weeks, our news cycle has really been filled with those two things. And quite clearly, democracy and vulnerability, we are talking about the contemporary moment in this country and with the election coming up. I am a historian and think about things from a historical point of view, and I'm curious and kind of thinking about all of these comparisons from history and putting it onto the contemporary day. To both of you, what do we gain by looking at the past to try to explain the contemporary political moment? And should we be wary of doing that? What do we maybe lose by trying to draw too many connections from the past to explain what's going on today?
I think that's such a relevant question, right? We're all struggling with this. Clearly, there's no absolute match, right? There's no historical event that will tell us, oh, this is exactly what's going to happen. But I will say, in our current political moment, that the lesson of the past is to believe what leaders say. They will do it, right? And in the current election, we have a far-right candidate, we'll say his name, Donald Trump, and we should believe what he's saying. Because if we look at the past, and people, they dismiss Mussolini as Hitler. Oh, well, that's just rhetoric. They're not really going to do that when they come to power. And in effect, they did. So, taking the past seriously, and perhaps some signs of how we can get out of the dilemmas and crises of the past to not make the same mistakes. One example might be the pattern of the past of a traditional conservative party and electorate aligning with the far right. That is something that brings fascist regimes to power. They can't come to power without the allegiance of the traditional right or even the center right. So that's a lesson we can draw out to contemporary times. Now, the second part of your question, what to be worried about? Exactly. We don't want to say, oh, here's a cookie cutter, and we're going to react the way things have reacted in the past. We were living in a very different media landscape, a very different political landscape. So both there are lessons and then things perhaps that are not applicable.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And obviously, sort of the first thing that comes to mind is exactly as Marla said, right? I think we can certainly look at things and developments that we saw in the past and try to understand them and see also, like the question headed in it, right? Are there some parallels that we think might apply? What are things that we can learn from the past, basically? Another thing that I would add is that in the last few years, in political science at least, there has been sort of a growing field of studies that looks at really sort of long-term consequences of things that happened in the past and how those can still affect sort of politics or basically our lives today. And I would say in political science, one of sort of the first projects that really sort of pushed this literature forward or introduced it to political science was, for example, a big study where some scholars at Harvard mostly found that sort of in the South, areas that used to have more slaves still tend to be more conservative today in terms of who they are voting for, but also in terms of the opinions that they are holding. I have worked on a similar project where we show that in Germany today, people who live closer to concentration camps tend to be more xenophobic and more likely to vote for right-wing parties. And so I think there's, in addition to sort of learning just what were causes and sort of drivers in the past, could they apply today, there's now sort of a relatively new, I would say still, way of thinking about sort of what are some really, really sticky kind of things that might still have happened in the past and affect things today. In terms of the limits of using history and what we might be missing, it's exactly right. I think what both of you said, right? Some parallels that we might see might not really be so close, right? And might be stretching it a bit. And obviously, I would also say there are just things in today's world that were not around 100 years ago, right? So whether we're thinking about the internet, social media, how information spreads, right? I think perhaps as a historian, right, Marla, I don't know what you would say, but there might still be some parallels, right? Perhaps we can say sort of the way that information spreads today with the internet, perhaps there's something in sort of the spread of the printing press that we can learn and sort of use to think about today. And if we're thinking about globalization today, perhaps there's something like sort of the spread of the railroads in the past, sort of that was connecting people in towns more, that could tell us something about today. But I think there's certainly going to be limits to sort of thinking about really new developments that just simply were not there in the past, basically.
Yeah, I love that, like, it's both long-term patterns and short kind of catchy lessons. Just the simple one of take the man seriously. Like listening to interviews with Trump voters, it's in the, deportation of immigrants. Trump supporters will say, well, he doesn't actually mean that. No, history tells us that we really should listen to what fascists are saying. And I know that's another word that in the media cycle is being thrown around a lot. So I want to invite Matt to ask a question to maybe help us narrow in our conversation to make sure that we know what we mean on this stage when we're using the word fascism.
Precisely that. I think it's one of those words that has now become part of our sort of cultural lexicon, but it's also being used quite freely. So I think sometimes accurately and other times cynically, intentionally to sort of make it meaningless. And so I was just curious, for the sake of the rest of this conversation and for how we engage with media for the next couple weeks and then after, because I don't think this ends one way or the other at the election. What's your sort of elevator pitch for what is fascism, and also what is it not, right? How should we be careful to not diffuse the meaning of the word so that it's so useful to talk about?
Yeah, I think this is incredibly important, and I've spent a lot of time in class talking about this. So historians debate whether there's a specific definition of fascism. Some people think it's just a practice. Some historians think it's an ideology that never fully got put into practice. I actually have a working definition, and that I think is very important because as Matthew said, it has become a word you use when you don't like people. Oh, you're such a fascist, right? And Donald Trump is calling Kamala Harris a Marxist, anarchist, fascist, throwing all these words together as if they all mean the same thing, and they don't. So what distinguishes fascism on the political spectrum is it is the only new ideology of the 20th century. If we want to sort of think in a political development of political theory way, the 18th century gave us liberalism, right? John Locke, the Enlightenment. The 19th century gave us socialism and Marx. And it was in the wake of World War I this new ideology called fascism is born. And what makes it different than, there's always been dictatorship. There have always been authoritarians, can go back to Augustus Caesar. But what is new here is that it requires the mobilization of the masses, right? So it is a movement of the extreme right that brings in the population. If you think of your first image of fascism, it's the mass crowd, right? It's the people in the brown shirts or the black shirts or the crowds lining the road in triumph of the will. It doesn't work unless you keep the population in a state of mobilization. You need the participation of the population. So that's the first thing. And then also this idea of the all-powerful state. So it's a kind of collectivism, but not the collectivism of the left where you're all going to work together to build a socialist utopia. It's the collectivism of renouncing yourself to the leader and the state because that leader and that state know more than you, right? They are the embodiment of the nation. So it is an irrational, actually, political philosophy. It rejects the rationality of liberalism. Where liberalism says, okay, we have 60 people in this room and we'll have committees and we'll have debates and we'll come to the best answer. Fascism says no. The answer is embodied in this leader who will move the nation forward, be it to the new Roman Empire or to the 1,000-year Reich. But you're going to give up your civil liberties, your right to vote, your right to assemble, your right to be charged when you're detained. But what are you going to get out of it? This ecstasy of the national movement forward. So hyper-nationalist, militarist, and this kind of renunciation. And of course, it's a reaction to the atomization that people felt in Europe in the mid-20th century, right? It's really hard to show up and have to find a job and find an identity. But fascism tells you, we've got all that for you. You join the Hitler Youth, you then move on to the Hitler University Group, etc. And I will turn it over to you now.
I would have had exactly the same reaction to say that different people might have slightly different definitions, but I think everything that Marla talked about was great. Perhaps a couple of things that I can add is that sort of thinking about European politics today, perhaps in cases where we might be thinking along similar lines, my impression would be that perhaps we're not talking so much about fascism necessarily, but perhaps neo-fascism or more recently even post-fascism. So if we're thinking about Giorgia Meloni in Italy, for example, Marine Le Pen in France, Alice Weidel in Germany, I think it's usually now become this term post-fascism that people are applying to those parties and to those leaders. And so perhaps we can sort of think about what that means. How does it differ from sort of the really historic and classic fascism? And does it tell us something? Is it sort of a useful concept for the US context perhaps as well? And I would say, for me, normally my main impression would be that sort of some of the biggest differences are that now these sort of post-fascists, they actually don't necessarily look like fascists anymore. So sort of, Marla mentioned sort of the brown shirts, black shirts, white boots, sort of these mass demonstrations and mass events and so on, and that we don't necessarily see quite like that anymore, right? Many of these politicians, they wear suits and ties just like any other politician. A lot of people would say that their positions, at least on some issues, have become more moderate. They are to some extent accepting kind of the democratic state and trying to get power sort of within this democratic setting and then try to implement their policies. I wouldn't say that makes these people or these parties less dangerous or less problematic, but it's perhaps a slightly different sort of strain of sort of the classic and historic fascism that we've seen. Now, in terms of the American context, right, that was part of the question, what does the term still mean if everybody's using it? I was thinking exactly the same as Marla, right? I think just earlier this week, actually, this new survey came out that I think around 50% think Trump is a fascist, but I think it was like 18% think Harris is a fascist, right? And so, yes, at that point, I think it's a fair and important question to ask. What does this actually mean? Like, well, what do people mean when they use this term? Is it just an insult? Is it just sort of a way to try to degrade my opponent? I think that's certainly part of it, right? And so I would say perhaps when something like that happens, when we see conversations taking turns like that, perhaps something important to still look for is who is making these claims about who, right? And so if we're just thinking now about the current context, I would say there's one side where we have basically people who used to work for that side, right? Who used to be on the staff, who used to be sort of close confidence now saying that basically about their own side, right? Be careful, these are fascists, which I think is a very, very different quality than if I'm just trying to sort of insult my political opponent, right? And so that might still be something that should be, I think, ringing alarm bells.
We didn't really talk about the gender component of it. And I think a through line in both historic fascism and today is a kind of anxiety about change in gender relations, right? In the 1920s, fascism was very much against the new woman, the woman who was out in the workplace and had cut her hair short, and they were going to, you know, in the German case, return women to the church, the kitchen, and the children. And current, you know, if we think of the American version, it is about a kind of threatened masculinity, right? Trump is signaling a desire for return to sort of traditional gender roles. How important do you think that is to a definition?
It's a good question. I guess I haven't necessarily thought about it directly in terms of how it affects the definition of fascism, but it is certainly an obvious parallel, I would say, right? And I think there's a number of components that make it such an important issue in this upcoming election, I think, right? It's both sides, right? It's the Trump side, I think, with sort of a very strong masculine image, right? With sort of very clear ideas of sort of what the role of the woman should be. And then on the other side, we don't just have any Democratic candidate, it's a woman who's running, right? And of course, that in a way sort of makes these ideas from the Trump side sort of more important and I think more visible. And there's also sort of a much, much stronger counterpoint, right? And on the other side, which I think really adds a lot, or helps us really explain why this is going to be such a major issue, I think, in this election. Yeah.
I mean, I just had a total aha moment where, like, the gender politics of this election is definitely something that I'm thinking a lot about. Childless cat ladies and Taylor Swift. And, like, on the one hand, it's kind of cute and funny, but then also connecting it to fascism in that way, it makes sense to me why gender, particularly in this election, is playing such a large role. But that goes back to larger themes of how fascism, the definition of fascism, has changed over time. So maybe gender is something that provides a through line, a reaction to the atomization of society as well. We're coming out of the pandemic, that was, cut a lot of social ties. Fascism also has changed, thinking about the suits and ties. I like that analogy. Brooke has a question about some other historical factors of the 20th century and the modern day that might also be changing the way that we should be relating to fascism.
Yeah. In recent years, American politics has kind of been riddled with misinformation. I feel like every time Trump is on your screen, he's saying something that isn't true or is being actively debunked. And my question is kind of about how misconceptions and misinformation has been a limb of, or even the head of a fascist movement in throughout history.
Yeah, I think absolutely would be the short answer, right? I think if we're thinking about both Germany and Italy, I mean, propaganda was just massive, right? And I don't know, perhaps it was one of the first times where really it was so massively used, right? And just all encompassing, and I think really helps explain a lot of why these movements were so successful, right? And of course it has a lot to do with kind of misinformation. Perhaps at times it might be sort of showing sort of what's going on from a certain angle. At times it might be outright lies, right? Something that I think we didn't really mention in the definitions of fascism was also, things like race theory, right? Just thinking about different social groups having different levels of importance or whatever you want to say, which is just completely insane, right? So yes, I think historically it's certainly been a really, really important part. And thinking about the present, I think that is still certainly true. But of course, it's also true that a lot of things about sort of misinformation and potentially lies, right, have dramatically changed since 100 years ago, right? So on the one hand, if we're thinking about today, sort of who is spreading misinformation, right? So I think, again, if we're thinking about the current upcoming election, I think we're very, very concerned about other countries, actors from other countries sort of spreading misinformation, right, and trying to affect the US election. And it's not just in the US, it's the same in European elections, where I think there's a really heightened concern that sort of, bad actors from other countries basically are trying to spread misinformation and sort of affect the outcome of an election. We also have very, very different ways of spreading misinformation, right? So again, sort of the internet, social media, right? How easy it has become to sort of fake images, fake videos, fake sort of voice notes. It's just much, much easier, I think, to create high-quality misinformation, and it's much, much easier to spread it. Perhaps the last thing that I will quickly say before I turn over to Marla is that something that a few recent studies sort of specifically on misinformation and political science find as well is that it's becoming more and more difficult to sort of correct misperceptions or misinformation. And so that might be a consequence of sort of the increase in polarization that we see, right? That basically when I believe in something and somebody comes along and tells me this is not true, even if they show me some really, really credible sources, it's becoming more and more difficult to really convince people that they are sort of on to something wrong and to sort of show them the truth, basically.
Really quick.
I'm
go ahead.
almost going to argue a little bit the opposite in that, I mean, it's absolutely true for both contemporary fascism and historic fascism that propaganda and what I would call the big lie were absolutely central, and information circulates faster and is more siloed today than it was in the 30s, 20s, 30s, and 40s. But if you think about when these regimes came to power, they had 100% control over what people saw, right? So in order to go to the movies, and the movies were the main entertainment in the early 20th century, you had to see a government regime newsreel, in the Italian case for 18 minutes. There was no counter newsreel. There was no other channel you could go to. And they would just present that as a lie, and then it would be repeated in the government-controlled newspaper. And, the big takeaway from Joseph Goebbels is you don't make it a small lie, you make it a big lie. One of the great examples of that was in September 1st, 1939, the German, or maybe it was the second or the third by the time it got into the theaters, described the Poles attacking Germany, and they showed footage of German missiles, bombs going over to the Polish side, but they just said it was the Poles bombing the Germans because, you couldn't really tell in the footage.
No, that just reminded me of some other articles I was reading about misinformation, where one of the great casualties in the contemporary society, where there's just this, mass amount of misinformation, is not just that people are believing too many lies, but they've become incapable of recognizing truth when they read it as well. And that's kind of the largest casualty, is because you could prove that this isn't true or that is a lie, but it's hard to then substitute it with but this is true, when they've been conditioned to sort of, be so skeptical and to kind of not have the capacity to recognize what is true versus what is false. And that makes it really difficult to build a constructive, anti-fascist movement or society. And
particularly when the misinformation is being produced from below and above. Like, you don't even really know the source of it.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that's exactly right. I mean, I don't know, and that could be an interesting question for all of you here. I think this is quickly becoming a really, really important skill that we will all have to learn, right? Is how to navigate these new information environments, how to figure out what is a lie, what is misinformation, what is sort of the truth. I think, sort of when I went to school, I would say that's not something that I ever thought about or that anybody would have tried to teach us. But I think going forward, certainly it's something that also as educators, we will have to devote sort of a significant amount of time on and make sure that that is something that young people learn.
I think Elsa has a great question connected to this idea of how do you teach in a setting where fascism is just around the corner?
So as Emma mentioned, this question speaks to your roles as academics and professors. You both have extensive experience teaching students and being in a classroom setting. Have you noticed any significant changes in student attitudes towards politics over the years? Also sort of thinking about pre- and post-pandemic times. And if so, have you adapted your teaching styles in response at all?
And in general, if I can just add on, like, how do you teach fascism in a setting where, you know, like, what will you do in your classes on election week? Yeah.
Yeah, those are great questions. I guess I would start by saying that sort of my actual teaching experience in the classroom actually for me hasn't been like that long. I guess now it's the 6th or 7th year that I'm sort of teaching classes. And so over that time period, I'm not sure that I have seen super dramatic changes in sort of how students think about politics and how they engage with politics. I will also say that I moved to UCLA just last summer, so I've been here for a year. Before that, I spent 5 years at Rice University in Houston, and both are universities that I think have a very, very liberal student body, and so to some extent, I think I might have to say less than if the student body looked a bit different, and I think most people in the classroom sort of have the same idea, even without me explicitly saying or explaining things. What I will say is that perhaps, if anything, my impression is that over the last few years, perhaps younger people, and that now I think I would really like to hear your opinion as well, might have become perhaps a bit more disillusioned and disengaged with kind of traditional political participation, as we would call it in political science, so voting basically. And I think by that I don't mean that young people are becoming sort of less political or less politically interested, but my impression is that perhaps many young people, or more and more young people, are sort of participating politically in sort of what we would call non-traditional or unconventional ways, right? And so you might be really engaged in some NGO work, or basically working on very specific issues that you strongly care about. And perhaps it's more sort of going to demonstrations, petition work, right? But really sort of perhaps more issue focused, and perhaps some sort of faith in sort of the political system has gotten lost along the way a bit. And now there's sort of more, almost more grassrootsy, more sort of bottom up, as Marla mentioned earlier, sort of activism that's going on. That would perhaps be my sort of broad impression, but would be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, so I've been teaching for 30 years. I teach at a liberal arts college, so in California. So the student body has always been fairly liberal, fairly progressive. They have gotten more so, I would argue. And then post-pandemic, what I've really noticed, I actually didn't teach for 4 years. I was in Rome, as Matthew mentioned, and I came back, and what I really noticed was a widespread questioning and what I would call denaturalizing of inherited categories, right? They're denaturalizing gender, they're denaturalizing sexuality, and they are beginning to really question capitalism. I think the environmental crisis is pushing a real questioning of capitalism. My students are scared, right? They don't know what is the world going to be like in 5, 10, 20 years. I agree a lot of the political work is grassroots, but I think for this election, they are quite worried. And I am teaching this semester a class on fascism. And so, you know, for most of my career, I taught it as something that had been defeated. And then now I have to teach it, you know, as something that we're struggling with. And the real moment of, oh my God, for me was, I was lecturing on the beer hall putsch of 1923, where Hitler is arrested and he's given a 5-year sentence and he only serves 10 months. And I had in my lecture notes, you know, can you imagine in the United States someone attempting to overthrow the government and serving 10 months? And then I was like, oh my God, this happened on January 6th. So, you know, I've seen this kind of, it get increasingly close to us in the course of my teaching. But I have great faith in the younger generation. I think they're doing some deep questioning, and you know, they have been in the streets in the last year over the war between Israel and Palestine, and that is politicizing a lot of them as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak for like my own personal political engagement kind of to both of you, where after 2016, that was my moment of turning away, of like, this system is not for me. How could this happen? I so distinctly remember walking around my high school the morning after the election, just like crying, and followed this really long period of disillusionment of like, what do you do if the system is that broken? What's interesting is obviously the system has become a lot more broken since then, and I'm a lot more scared. And I think that is causing a return to interest in politics and interest in engagement and a feeling of a sense of empowerment. And so I have a question about the rise of Italian fascism, specifically for Marla, but I'd love both of you to answer it, where in a talk you gave at the American Academy in Rome, you say, from the very start, fascism defined itself in opposition to its political enemies it declared existential threats to the survival of the nation. And when I read that quote, I also see there's fear there. There's a nation that is at the threat of being extinct. If Trump is a fascist, and if what is happening in America might be fascism, what is the nation that Trump and his cadres are so concerned about protecting?
Yeah, wow, great question, thank you. Italian fascism came to power based on the fear of many Italians, particularly middle class and upper class Italians, because there had been a near revolution of the left. After World War I, the Italian economy was in crisis. There was a radicalization of socialists and communists. So the fascists emerge and say, we're going to save the nation. These forces, these socialists and communists, are anti-nation. They are coming to destroy the nation, to destroy what it is to be Italian, to destroy the economy. They were cowards in World War I. I think this discourse will sound sort of familiar. So the fascists said, we are the only ones. We were there. They take the memory of World War I and they say, that was a precursor to fascism. So that we are going to take on the mantle of the nation, protect the nation from this corrosive force on the left. We are going to lead to a national regeneration. There's a historian who talks about fascism, Roger Griffin, as palingenesis, right, as the rebirth of the body politic. But that palingenesis requires the purging of the unhealthy elements from society. So in Italian fascism, it was the political left, the political enemy. In Nazism, we know it was the combination of the Jews and the Bolsheviks, right? That concept of Judeo-Bolshevik. So it plays out slightly different in each case, but enemies are absolutely central, and we see it in the campaign of today, right? The dehumanizing of migrants. I would say you could plug migrant right into Jew or communist, and then giving the migrants these non-human qualities, eating pets. There was a speech in the last couple of days where Donald Trump said they're coming across the border with swastikas, tattoos on their face, and they're all murderers, right? So that's going to cultivate a kind of terror. And apparently yesterday he had some families who were members of the family had been attacked or murdered by immigrants. So.
Yeah, I think that's right. Perhaps I'll add, I think sort of the enemy or sort of the nation that he might be trying to protect, I think it's not just migrants. I think it's also Americans who basically don't look or think like him, right? And
who disagree with him.
Well, yeah,
the enemy within.
Yeah, the enemy within, right? And I think, right, whether it's the policies on abortion, sort of same-sex marriage, right, or these kinds of things, they don't actually, I think it's not migrants who are sort of the target of that and who are sort of the enemy within, right? It's actual Americans. It's white Americans. White and non-white Americans. But I think so. So those, I would say, are sort of the two groups here. Migrants as sort of the most obvious outgroup, but then sort of even within the American population, there's, I think, a whole range of people who wouldn't be part of that nation or who are not part of that nation that sort of, in those eyes, might be worth protecting, basically.
Yeah, and I think, think how explosive the combination of saying there's an internal threat and an external threat, right? That's the fear that you were talking about. You get people in this fear state that they're coming from the outside and they're coming from the inside. And then, of course, we have to put on top of it the replacement theory, right? They're coming to replace us and to replace our way of life. That can mobilize people to support very destructive policies and ideas.
Destructive policies and ideas in the service of something, allegedly, that will be beautiful and harmonious. And Sarah has a question kind of about the before and after aspect.
Yeah, you describe fascism as a reaction to communists kind of destroying the nation. And so I think about kind of this comparison between two forces in society, and also kind of visualizing these threats as we were discussing, like Trump does in his speeches with immigrants with swastikas on their foreheads. I had not heard that. That's crazy. But so this kind of pertains to that talk you gave at the American Academy in Rome, but I'd be really curious to hear both your perspectives on this. So you shared this visual analysis of some postcards produced by the Fascist National Party in 1923, which kind of showed these before and after scenes showing chaos and violence under Bolshevism, and kind of contrasting that with a more harmonious outlook under fascism. So I kind of thought this was really an interesting example of visual materials produced for the purpose of visualizing the enemy in an attempt to influence voters. And I was wondering if you could both expand on the role that aesthetics and visual arts play in influencing voters during election seasons, either throughout history, today, or even both.
Sure. The postcard that Sarah is referring to were a series of postcards put out in 1923, just as the fascist regime was consolidating. And so on one side of the card, you would see houses in flames and women holding children that looked starving, and there was chaos, and there was all this gender mixing and red flags and an unproductive economy. And the other part of the postcard had men working, women at home, everything was in order, men were in uniform. And so this idea of law and order versus chaos gets played over. In that case, the visual accelerates, and by the mid-1930s, the enemy is really subhuman. And so there's all these visuals around, by the late 30s, a Soviet enemy coming who is really a bloodthirsty monster, who is coming to steal your children, and this kind of thing. Now, the contemporary visuals, this gets to how complex the media environment is. Gosh, I don't have a great answer to that. I think I'll turn that over to you.
Yeah, so I think historically I completely agree, right? And thinking about the Nazis, again, sort of the propaganda that we mentioned earlier, sort of the huge marches, parades, right? I think Leni Riefenstahl was this like director that made those movies that were really, really fundamental in sort of shaping the aesthetics and the optics of kind of how the Nazis wanted to be seen, how they, I guess, wanted Germans to think about sort of the German people, right, the Aryan race and so on, played a massively important role in sort of what the Nazis were doing and trying to achieve, and how they were, sort of shaping sort of their ideas sort of through aesthetics. Today, I would say, yes, I think visuals are still extremely important, right? But in a very different way, I would say. So, I mean, all of you presumably, right? I think from social media we know, it feels to me that now sort of having a good TikTok video where either your candidate is delivering like a good line, or where the other candidate is really messing up and looking really silly, means a lot, right? Can have sort of a really, really big impact. Sort of a clever meme, right? I think, so the Harris campaign, I guess, has been really, really successful, I think, in terms of sort of churning out a lot of this content that's really, it's really like snapshots, right? Leni Riefenstahl made these like movies that were hours and hours long, and people watched them in the cinemas, and that was kind of it. But I think now in sort of our information environment today, we want these kind of quick things that get a message across like really, really fast and hammer something home. And so I think it's changed a bit like that, but still plays a really, really important role, certainly, I would say.
Yeah, I guess I would like to add something to the question about visual culture, which is conspiracy theories, right? Conspiracy theories are part of this always, and in our contemporary case, they're spreading at, lightning speed, and then they get sort of changed and morphed. And I actually ran into a woman here in Los Angeles walking down the street in Santa Monica who had a T-shirt on, and it had Smokey the Bear, and then it said, "Only you can stop communism, vote Trump." So I stopped her because I'm very interested in this question. And, she said, "Oh, yeah, I got it on the internet." And then she said, "Oh, are you interested in these things? Because I want to tell you something I just read." She said, "Gavin Newsom passed a law that underage girls can have sex with older men so that he can raise the electricity rates." And I said, I don't understand that. And she said, oh, yeah, it's on the internet. And she said, I'll send you the link. And I'm like, no, thank you. But so, these things on Instagram and TikTok, they're so quick, they can easily spread a conspiracy theory and a story that makes no sense, and then there's no check on it.
Aesthetically, I was thinking about that question too, and I think anti-urbanism is maybe the other big one, the destroyed cities from riots. And every time that kind of Trump has talked in like Detroit or other cities, he's often referencing as if they were burned to the ground in 2020. And I think because cities in this case represent multiculturalism or the cultural elite, you have that juxtaposition between the pure traditional rural population, then you have the sort of cosmopolitan decadence and multicultural destruction of urban hellscapes in a sense. And I think that's often been maybe what I've been seeing be more successful is the invocation of urban decay as the inevitable result of a democratic majority, I think.
And the anti-family discourse.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah, there's no single family homes in cities. The government raises your children there, et cetera. There's
right.
kind of...
Or the idea that the Democrats are coming to destroy the family, right? Mm-hmm. That they're... One of the conspiracy theories that they're letting 13-year-olds have transition surgery and this kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And of course, I would add just the inner city versus rural area. Of course, there's then the famous suburban neighborhoods as well, right? Which are sort of a big battleground, I think, for precisely these issues as well. Yeah.
And what's so interesting about visualization in general is they are very polarized. There's no middle ground. It's either everything's awful or everything's great. And so I want to skip ahead a little bit to have Matt ask a question about the role that polarization might be playing in today's context and how it actually might be helpful.
Yeah, so as we're getting toward the end of our conversation, I would love to pivot a little bit towards, so what do we do, right? Because I think, we can do well to understand the phenomenon and understand the historical precedents that led to this moment, the terms and the all the different factors that are going on. But then I think I in my own studies of fascism, I constantly come up against this sense of we're so aware of the threat it poses to every area of our life, and then when it comes to the actual mechanisms by which we might resist it, it's difficult in a way, and our answers are sometimes very systemic and broad and require generations of education. But then that gets difficult. But what do we do kind of now in our daily lives? And we had a speaker in, I think, January or February who is coming from a German context. And his research often focused on narrative and generating narratives that can resist fascist ascension. And he was very positive on actually the need for polarization in society as a way of, we need to be incredibly vocal and clear so that the idea that the fascists or the far-right party, that they're the, the unspoken majority, the silent majority. He's like, we cannot let them believe that they're the silent majority. They have to know that they are a minority political movement that does not have political influence. And the way that he sort of talked about that process was by increasing polarization and by increasing the demonization of this movement. And on the one hand, I agree to the need to really be clear about the threat that far-right movements pose. But I think in the American context, there's a lot of very intentional blurring that's been done within kind of far-right parties to say, oh, whenever they say fascist or whenever they say far-right, they mean the everyday American. Right, and there's this kind of rhetorical bleeding that's been done where when we maybe try to polarize it against fascists, you get a sort of, bucket of deplorables moment, right? Where then there's a whole, group of people who think that you're talking about them and you're denigrating them. So what is kind of your understanding of, the pros and cons of polarization? How do we, in a sense, have moral clarity in the public sphere? How do we speak with moral clarity? But in a polarized society where that can be a bit more combustible than we would like.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's a really, really difficult question, but of course it's
if you could just really wrap it up, solve this now, that'd be great. Yeah.
Yes, I wish. I wish. I mean, I would hope we all wish, right? We could. But yeah, obviously it's a super, super important question, right? I would say kind of the approach that you mentioned that sort of a previous speaker brought up, sort of from the German context, it sounded like about like really, really pointing out fascism and extremism when we see it. I think something that I would like perhaps caution there or make sure to keep in mind is sort of the difference in sort of electoral systems and party systems and political systems, especially if we're now comparing the US and Germany, right? So Germany has a multi-party system where I think you can point out something like that, and then people who sort of might be voting for a far-right party, they are still going to have alternatives that are like somewhat close to them and that they might be able to sort of move to without moving all the way over to the left, right? Now, if we're thinking about the US context, the moment that you say that about, let's say, Trump and like Trump voters, one is you're basically saying it to half of the country, right? And so it is not a majority, but it's also really not a tiny minority. It is pretty much half of the country at this point, right? The second point is, if now we have, let's say, even both sides calling each other fascists, right? I think my hunch would be that's probably really not sort of the most promising strategy in this case, right? Because I think we see both parties doing that right now, and I think it's a technique that they are using, I would say, mostly to mobilize their own supporters, where I think it can be really, really effective. But I think it's probably not super effective in terms of sort of swaying potential swing voters, right? Where in this current context, I think, first of all, we don't really know how many swing voters are there actually. Both parties, both candidates now are pretty well known what they stand for, so how many people's minds are we actually going to change? But I think if we want to do that, and even outside of the context of this election, right, if we're thinking about the future, as I think you are, I would probably sort of warn against overly demonizing the other side and sort of criticizing things too harshly, but sort of trying to win people over by focusing on politics and sort of political solutions, right? And sort of really try to show perhaps what do we still have in common, even though we vote for dramatically different parties with sort of dramatically different leaders. I think for a lot of people, there's still many things that we have in common, many problems that we want to solve. And so I think solutions, I would say, really have to focus more on sort of bringing people together and sort of pacifying this really, really aggressive discourse that we're seeing at the moment, instead of sort of adding even more fuel to the fire by only pointing out sort of how bad and how terrible the other side is.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. I think there's sort of two practical things that we can do. This kind of politics emerges when people feel like their lives are not working, right? When they're angry and they don't understand, why they've gotten a raw deal. And I think the thing the Democrats, now they're sort of tacking to the center right. The answer would be to solve the economic problem, right? There are way too many Americans that are not making ends meet. And then, because of sort of the complications and polarization of our political discourse, they get drawn to a politics of hate and resentment instead of identifying, well, we need to change the tax structure, that the state can be a force for good. Government, I personally think when Reagan said government is the problem, we started to go down that rabbit hole. So one would be sort of identifying those problems that make people so resentful and solving them materially. And then the second one is to keep in mind that the right has played a very long game, right? They've been getting on school boards and local legislatures for 30, 40 years. One thinks of that book, Democracy in Chains. Nancy, I'm blanking on her last name. Somebody will remind me. But Democracy in Chains, she talks about how this has been a very long game for the right. So the Democrats need to do the same thing and run for school board and run for city council and the like, and try to affect the discourse at that level.
Where do you guys see the future of research and sort of academic works on fascism and I guess just political science in general going? And are there any emerging areas of study that are particularly interesting to you?
Yes, I want to sort of jump back for 1 second to the earlier question about what to do. And I do think that we all have to keep in mind, if things go in an anti-democratic direction, that we may have to go into the streets. If we go back to the 1923 beer hall putsch, the thing that defeated it was the general strike called by the unions in Munich. So just, to put that out there, that we may need a general strike. Hopefully it doesn't come to that. In terms of the study of fascism. So I'm a historian rather than a political scientist, and the people who study fascism studies, we've spent a lot of time debating, is Trump a fascist? In 2016, 2017, we said no. Now people are turning and saying yes. So that has taken a lot of the field's time, applying the past to the present. There's also a move towards comparative far-right studies. So, the focus used to be Italy and Germany, Italy and Germany. Now there's an attention on Spain and Portugal and Japan, and thinking more about a spectrum of the far right rather than the two extreme examples. Where do we put the many countries that had far-right movements in the interwar period? How do we compare those with the two more famous regimes? There's a real turn to transnational and comparative history.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels to that in political science, actually. So I would say in political science, there are usually some people who have specific questions and issues that they care about, and they will always work on those. But sort of a good amount of the discipline, I would say, is reacting to what's actually happening in the real world, which makes a lot of sense, right? We're following politics, and we want to understand what's happening. And when there are problems, we're trying to find solutions to them, right? So exactly what Marla just talked about, the sort of spread of far-right parties being really successful in elections across Europe has been something that lots of people have been studying in political science in recent years, and that I would imagine is going to continue to be an important topic over the next few years. And then I think, just sort of talking about what we've been talking about, sort of no matter what happens in this election in, I guess now 10 days or something like that, I think we will all have to think about how to move forward, right? And how to move forward together, and how to bring people together again, and sort of get back to sort of a more normal sort of discourse and sort of community that we have in this country here, but also in many other countries where we see tendencies and sort of situations like that happening.
That's a beautiful place to end. Thank you so much. Thank you both.